Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Winters. I'm an associate professor here at BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. I'm really excited to be here today to moderate this panel. This is the Social Justice and Equity Seminar Series that we host within the college every Thursday at this time. So please, if you're new to the series, please keep an eye out for our future events. I wanted to let everyone know at the beginning here that we will be recording this session. The session will be made publicly available for your ability to review and also for sharing as well. Another just house cleaning note, during the session, the chat is going to be disabled. There should be on your screen a feature for a Q&A. If you have questions to ask for our panel, if you can put the questions in the Q&A, we're going to have the presentation and we'll have Q&A afterwards, and I'll be moderating that Q&A box in order to run the questions, and we'll cover that at the end of the initial presentation. We're also, one other last thing to flag for everyone, at the end of this session, there will be on your screen, should pop up a brief 5-question survey at the end about the session and the series. We'd really appreciate your participation for that. If you can hang on until the end and answer that, we'd really, really appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and get us started. So again, my name is Marcus Winters, and I'm here to talk about with two authors, two new faculty members within the BU Wheelock, a really creative and timely paper looking at titled "The Inequality in Household Adoption to Schooling Shocks," and they're looking at COVID-induced online learning engagement in real time. This is a paper by two of our newest faculty members at BU Wheelock, Joshua Goodman and Andrew Bacher-Hicks. Josh has joined us as an associate professor here at BU Wheelock, and Andrew Bacher-Hicks has joined us as an assistant professor. Both are professors in educational policy within our Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. And they're part of an exciting team that we have building up here, and at BU Wheelock we're really excited to see their work and excited to share with you the new work that they're doing. So again, this is a paper looking at COVID-induced online learning engagement. It's also co-authored with their co-author Christine Mulhern at RAND. I'll let Andrew and Josh talk about the paper, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So with that, I'll send it over to Josh.
Great, thank you so much, Marcus. Andrew's going to share our slides. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is sort of month, I think, 3 of me and Andrew being new faculty members at Wheelock, and we're thrilled to be part of this community. So what we're going to talk about today is work that we started not so long ago, although it feels like a century ago. And it was prompted in part by my own experience in March. We have 3 elementary school age children, twins who are in 2nd grade and a 10-year-old who's in 5th grade. And like many Americans, our kids were in a public school that in late March shut down. And what I watched happen to our household was we as parents started to scramble to figure out what do we do with our children, given that schools have shut down and the move to remote instruction is at best rocky and at worst non-existent for some days of the week. And so what we're going to do in this paper is try to take a look beyond just my household and ask what was happening in the United States during the spring of this past year as schools began to shut down. So we're thinking about this period. By April 2020, nearly every public school in the country had closed. That's over 50 million students who no longer had in-person schooling. Most schools begin some form of virtual education, although what that means is quite varied and raises tons of concerns about what the effects of this shift are going to be. And in particular, one of the major concerns was this sort of well-documented digital divide, both in terms of access to technology, but also in terms of knowledge and sort of capacity to use technology to do education. And so the concern is that this shift would exacerbate existing gaps in learning and achievement that already existed by income, by race, by parental education. And, you know, on the one hand, this is in some sense the only paper I've ever written that I wish had become rapidly irrelevant. But unfortunately, many schools in the US, including my own children's school, remain virtual this fall. And so the broad sort of things we're going to do in this paper feel, unfortunately, still relevant going forward. And so what are we going to do in the paper? What are we going to ask? We're going to ask two major questions. The first one is, how did households in the United States, meaning students and parents, but also to an extent schools, how did households and schools adapt to these widespread school closures in response to the pandemic in terms of the learning resources that were being used during the shift to virtual instruction? So how did that happen across the United States? And can we provide any evidence about whether the effects of that shift to virtual instruction and the way households responded to it differ by socioeconomic status and other dimensions like race and parental education that we might care about? So I'm now going to turn it over to Andrew, who will sort of talk about what is the data that we use to actually tackle these questions and what did we find, and then I'll come back with conclusions at the end.
Great, thanks so much, Josh, and thanks, Marcus, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today sharing this paper, and also really excited to be joining. This is the first public talk I've given as a new faculty member, as part of the BU Wheelock community. So really excited to be here and sharing this. As Josh mentioned, so this paper is a little bit different for a number of reasons. The first is that we were essentially trying to answer a question in just about real time. So schools began closing in the United States right around March. That's sort of right around the time that we started working on this paper, which is very atypical. I've never worked on a project where I'm literally trying to answer the question as it's unfolding in the community. And so we had to get a little bit creative about our data sources for this project in particular. And our main outcome variable comes from Google Trends, which provides a publicly and freely available measure of search intensity for any keyword that you would want to type in. And anything that anybody is searching for on Google, you can track the popularity or intensity of that term using Google Trends. Essentially what it does is provides a measure of the fraction of all of the searches on Google that were devoted to that term. And so you can see the image here on the right shows just one example of that relates to this paper. It shows the search intensity for the keyword online learning over the past 12 months. And you can see that there was a relatively flat popularity or intensity for that keyword over roughly the past 9 months. But then there was a spike that happened right around early March as schools began closing in response to COVID. And so this is a great simple example of what we're going to try to address in this paper. To what extent are students, families, households seeking out additional online resources in response to schools that are closing and the loss of instruction that's associated with them? So to do that, we leveraged Google Trends. It provides both data over time, like you're seeing here in the image on the right, but also data across groups of counties. So these are called designated market areas. There are 210 designated market areas in the United States. And so for every designated market area, you can determine whether or not one area is searching for a specific term more than another area is. And so we identified a list of 45 different search terms that are related to online learning. And I'll show you in the next slide a list of what some of those are. And for every digital market area or designated market area, for every week over roughly a 5-year period, we collected the search intensity for each of those terms. And this essentially gives us our outcome variable of interest. To what extent are people over time and across regions searching for online resources? And in particular, how does that change in response to COVID right around March and May and April of 2020? In addition to that, we will provide some background information to help characterize some of these market areas. We use the 2016 American Community Survey to identify things like average income in each DMA or each region, the fraction of adults with a bachelor's degree, the fraction of households with broadband internet access, also the fraction of households with computers in the home. Things like that will come from the ACS. And we also have data from the Stanford Educational Data Archive, which provides information about schools and the school-age population, such as the fraction of schools that are in rural areas in every DMA, and also the racial composition of the school-age population. So all of that will provide additional background information about these geographic areas. So first, now over the next 4 slides, I will present 4 key findings from the paper. The first is that, as I said before, we identified 45 different search terms that were related to online learning. And we found that these terms fell into roughly 2 categories, which we called school-centered resources and parent-centered resources. You can think of school-centered resources as something like Google Classroom, which was by far the most popular search term that we identified, as a way that teachers might interact with students, or teachers or other administrators in a school might interact with students. So it's something that employees of the school are using to connect with students. Google Classroom is far and away the most popular term, and everything else in this table that I'm presenting here is presenting the intensity relative to Google Classroom. So for example, in the pre-COVID period, Kahoot was the next most popular term, and it was about 1/3 as popular as Google Classroom was. In addition to these school-centered resources are things like just more general terms that we're calling parent-centered resources. These would be things in our mind that parents might be searching for, sort of as Josh was describing earlier in the beginning for the motivation. You know, as schools are closing, parents were often looking for additional resources to provide to their children, and they might be Googling things like math worksheets, problem solving, online reading, to try to have additional resources that they can provide for their children. These, you'll notice, are far less popular than the school-centered resources. The most popular parent-centered resource was online school, and in the pre-COVID period, that was only 4% as popular as Google Classroom. All of these terms, however, became more popular, or just about all of them became more popular after COVID as opposed to before COVID. Finding 2 is that both school-centered resources and parent-centered resources, the intensity of searches for them followed typical patterns throughout the school year. Here I'm presenting a chart over roughly 3 school years, and on the y-axis I'm presenting the logarithm of search intensity for these terms, which can be roughly interpreted as the percentage increase in the popularity of these terms relative to March 1st, 2020, which can be roughly thought of as the sort of the onset of COVID-induced school closures. And so what you'll see is right around here in the beginning of the school year. So this, for example, is September of 2017. Terms for searches for school-centered resources are relatively more popular, although that popularity sort of roughly declines throughout the school year until over the summer months, it all but vanishes. Essentially, nobody is searching for Google Classroom or Khan Academy or any of those school-centered resources over the summer. I'll also note there are a couple of points here where essentially nobody is searching for these school-centered resources, which correspond to 3 sort of special weeks over the school year. One is the Thanksgiving week break, and then there are 2 weeks over the winter holiday session where nobody is really searching for any school-centered resources. And this pattern tracks pretty closely both in the, from September 2017 throughout the rest of that school year, and then that pattern kind of repeats itself again in September of 2018 and repeats itself again in September of 2019 here, although it was largely disrupted, as you can see by this dashed line, in March of 2020 as schools closed in response to COVID. The same pattern you'll notice with parent-centered resources, where there's this, it's initially somewhat higher as the school year starts out, and then a large drop-off over the summer that repeats year after year after year. But again, it was largely disrupted by COVID. when there was a large spike, both for these parent-centered resources and for the school-centered resources. And this is going to motivate what we're going to essentially dig into in a little bit more detail in the rest of the paper, but really just shows that people are looking to Google and other online resources in order to sort of supplement what perhaps they were losing as schools started closing. Finding number 3 is that this jump in search intensity right around March 2020 as schools were closing was not equally spread across every region in the United States. So here we're presenting a map of these 210 market areas. And the areas that are shaded in a darker color are areas in which that jump right around March 2020 was larger. And so, for example, you'll see that in areas right around New England, some parts of Texas, for example, other areas around the West Coast, you'll see that there were relatively larger increases in this demand, or relatively larger increases in searches for online learning resources. Areas that are shaded in a lighter color, you can see a large swath around here, had relatively lower increases. Every area increased somewhat in searches for online learning resources, but the jumps or the increases were lower in these areas. And it motivates the last finding, which I'll show, which is to what extent are there different characteristics of these regions that might correlate with these relatively either larger or smaller increases in online searches as schools closed. And so I will just present one simple categorization of this, but in the paper we dig into it in much more detail. And that is, if we look at a broad composite measure of socioeconomic status, or SES, which includes things like income in that area, education levels, levels of internet connectivity, for example, areas that had higher SES, or on average higher income, more educated, more internet connectivity. In those areas, there were relatively larger increases in searches compared to the lower SES regions. And so we do that by essentially comparing everything relative to point 0 here, which is March 1st of 2020. And we're essentially comparing the difference between searches for searches in high SES areas relative to low SES areas. And we see that there are really no trends before COVID, but then after COVID, there's a relatively larger increase in searches in these high SES areas compared to the low SES areas. And it's a little bit hard to tell from this chart alone, but in the paper we talk about it in much more detail. Searches were roughly twice as large, or that increase was roughly twice as large in the high SES areas as opposed to the low SES areas. And this is true both in terms of these school-centered resources. So again, things like Google Classroom, Khan Academy, Kahoot, Schoology, things like that, sort of branded, packaged resources that schools are using to provide resources to students. But also these more general terms, the parent-centered resources, things like math worksheets that we're thinking parents are more likely to be searching for supplemental materials. And so in both cases, we see that the searches increased more in the relatively higher SES areas. Now, the last thing to point out, I'll turn it back to Josh in a moment to wrap up and summarize the conclusions and get us started. We can kick off a larger conversation around these findings. The last thing to mention is that this measure of SES, obviously many things are all captured in this broad measure: income, education, internet connectivity. We, in the paper, look at each of those separately, and we find very consistent patterns. We find that the increases were higher in relatively higher income areas. The jumps were higher in areas that were more educated. The jumps were higher in areas that had more internet connectivity, areas that were less rural, things like that. So basically every single component that factors into this broad measure of SES, if we look individually at them, we see a very consistent pattern. And so essentially, as Josh will talk about in just a minute when we wrap up, it appears that we're finding some new evidence of a new digital divide, or that gaps are sort of widening along these dimensions, along many of these dimensions, which I've just summarized here with SES, but you can imagine it expanding along a number of dimensions. And with that, I will turn it back over to Josh.
All right, well, thanks, Andrew. So I'm just going to conclude here with a couple last comments before we open it up to a broader conversation. So that, you know, the big findings we want you to take away from this is that when COVID struck, there's a huge nationwide spike in the number of households searching for supplementary resources, whether it's through their schools, you know, in partnership with their schools, like Google Classroom, or parents on their own figuring out a way to compensate for lost schooling entirely. And those searches, the intensity of those searches, that rise in search behavior is quite different in high income versus low income areas in a way that's going to likely exacerbate educational gaps. And so I think the broad point we sort of want to leave with, sort of what does this mean? What do we think the implications of this are for educational systems, for public policy? So, you know, one broad point we just want to make is that the way that households adapt to these schooling shocks, it's nice that we can observe it in real time using this internet search data. We don't think this has been done before. We can show in real time that these school closures induced households to seek out ways to compensate for the lost in-person schooling that their children no longer had. The fact that there are socioeconomic differences in the intensity of this change in behavior highlights a new aspect of the digital divide that may be related to technology access. It may be related to sort of knowledge about potential online resources. It may be related to the amount of time parents have to spend schooling their kids at home. We think that the fact that this data can be accessed in real time, literally every week, and, you know, or even every day, actually, new data is coming out. We think this can be useful to policymakers who maybe need to figure out quickly what's going on with households in their area broadly. And it also supports easy reanalysis. And so what we mean by that is it will not be terribly difficult to take the work that we've done and in some sense do it all over again now that the fall school year has started to begin. And I know that in some places it hasn't actually yet begun, but it very well may be that these behaviors are somewhat different in the fall because they, in the spring, it represented short-term effects of households and parents scrambling to figure out what was going on. Now in the fall, people may be seeking out different ways to compensate, knowing that some of these changes in education seem to be longer lasting than we may have first expected. People may come up with new keywords for us to look at. Again, very easy to incorporate into this analysis. And there's nothing unique about this data set that says this kind of analysis can't be done in other countries. It's probably most interesting in other large countries where you could study some of this heterogeneity by within country geography. But the fact is, for any country, which is basically all countries, nearly all countries on Earth covered by Google's database, you could go in and see whether this kind of search behavior changed when COVID struck. You know, broadly, this kind of inequality in access to and the use of online learning resources during the pandemic almost certainly is going to widen knowledge gaps. I will say we actually have very little direct evidence of this yet, although I think we'll be seeing more of that as time goes on. But we will say that what little evidence we have, the Opportunity Insights team, the group run by Raj Chetty and John Friedman in Harvard Square, they've got at least one study out suggesting that there have been very clear widening of math knowledge gaps. And our work here points to one potential channel that may explain these widened learning gaps, both now and in the future, which is to say that households really differ in the extent to which they are helping their children sort of either access their school materials or find supplemental materials outside of the school-provided work to help their kids learn. All of this broadly suggests some potential policy responses, which may feel obvious, may not, but the broad point that students in sort of low SES, low-income areas and rural communities in particular are likely going to need additional support, both in terms of technological access to these kind of resources, but also in terms of support just using them. Even once a kid has internet access and a computer, it's not clear that all households equally well know how to take advantage of those resources. And sort of most broadly, it seems like improving engagement with online learning is going to be key to equalizing learning opportunities and preventing a further widening of knowledge gaps during the pandemic. And I think that's something that we are increasingly beginning to realize as we see, at least in this part of the country, more and more school systems not reopening and in fact making choices to do remote schooling, particularly for older students. So broadly speaking, we're very excited about this project. We're excited that we could join WheeLook at exactly the moment when this work was becoming relevant. And we're really interested to hear what kind of questions folks in this audience have and see if we can do our best job to answer them and to think about where this work might go in the future.
Great. Well, thanks very much, guys, for the presentation there. Everyone who's watching, the question and answer box is available for you to post your questions. I'll be keeping an eye on that. Please don't be shy. We have about, what, 35 minutes or so for Q&A, and we really hope to have your participation. So I guess, I mean, I can start off the conversation. I'll take the moderator's prerogative, I suppose, with to start off the conversation. And first, I'd like to say, I mean, obviously this is excellent and timely work. I mean, it also, as a parent of a kindergartner and a second grader who, started school in the last couple of days, and who in the spring and the summer was mostly responsible for their schooling and their activities. I gotta say that this hits close to home. My Googling for seesaw and other things definitely was went from 0 to a lot in a pretty short period.
Marcus, sorry, I'll just interject to say that there's this phrase that all research is me-search, and this I want to be very honest that the thing that prompted this project for me was exactly the fact that we were scrambling to do this kind of how do we help our kids in this troubled time. So this is very much I'm glad this is close to your heart. I think there are a lot of parents out there who feel that way.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, among friends and family, I'd say this is one that, like, if the results didn't turn out this way, I would have been quite surprised. But which actually gets, so one question that I have, and I think it might be especially helpful in for this audience. Could you give us a little feel for, like, I mean, obviously the result is here. Can you give us a little feel for the magnitude of this result? I mean, it's not like a number, but I mean, how much of a difference, was, I mean, not only like an increase in the searches, but how big were those differences? Just because they're on indices on the left-hand side there. So I'm wondering if we can kind of wrap our arms around it a little bit.
Andrew, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm going to have to remember these. So correct me if I misremember.
To get into a decimal point, yeah.
But one way to think about it. So SES makes it kind of hard because it's an index. So one way of thinking about this might be in terms of average income. And so one statistic is that regions where the average income is $10,000 higher than other regions. So in those regions where average income is $10,000 higher, that jump was 15% more for every $10,000 that you increase. So a fairly large gradient or relationship between those two. Another way of thinking about it is if you just split the country in half, and so you have those, I think it was 210 digital designated market areas. So you have 155 and 155, and you look at the ones that have the highest SES versus the lowest SES, that jump was twice as high in the high SES area, in the 155 that were the highest SES compared to the 155 that were the lowest SES. So I think those are two different ways of thinking about the same thing. And in the paper, we describe a number of different ways that you could think about it in terms of increasing access to broadband or percent of schools that are rural and things like that.
The other just number that I would throw out there is, if I remember correctly, broadly speaking, nationwide, the fraction of household searches devoted to these terms jumped by something like 70%. Is that right? 70%.
I remember
something very large.
Roughly doubling, but maybe it was close.
Oh, maybe anyway. All right, maybe it was 70 log points. Anyway, it was a big, the fraction of energy households were spending on this topic went up by a very large fraction.
Great. Another question that I have here is, I mean, and neither of you, I think, would claim to be super experts on the use of kind of these digital tools. Though Josh, I think you've done a little bit of work on like online work. Do we? I think regardless, we might expect this to have an effect, right? If only kind of like the selection of the type of person who's looking for more, you know, for more of these tools might also be looking for other ways to help their kids. But do we have a feel from the research about how effective some of these things that people are looking for actually might be?
Yeah, I'll give you my 2 cents, which is I think that at least our world of education policy researchers has spent relatively little energy on these questions of how effective these, in some sense, private investments in children's education turn out to be for their learning outcomes. And part of that is our own fault, but I think part of that is also, you know, what data do we have available in the world? Well, most of the data we have available, when it's available, comes from schools. And so we probably spend 95% of our energies studying school-based data. I think part of what this pandemic is making clear is that we should be probably diverting more of our research energies into thinking about what is going on in the home. And what was nice for us is that this Google Trends search data made it almost costless to get at least one measure of this. But I think the broader question of whether these private investments in time and money and technology pay off for children is one that, you know, I'm hoping some set of researchers really turn their attention to.
And I'll just add to that briefly, which is that, you know, these things were happening at a much smaller scale before COVID. And now when schools are closing, as we sort of talked about in response to that first question, and both of you in your personal lives now know, you know, really a lot of schooling has turned to parents and other resources in addition to schools now. So something that was happening at a much smaller scale before is now really turning to look to both the household, parents, and additional either online or potentially private companies to help partially fill this gap. And so I think we're in an interesting place where this sector is going to be expanding a lot over the next couple of months.
I'll also make one quick plug for a research paper that I'm hoping we'll post a draft of sometime in the not so distant future, which is all pre-COVID, but is about the fact that over the last 20 years, there's been a major rise in after-school tutoring centers like Kumon, like Sylvan, like in the Boston area, the Russian School of Math, which represent the sort of flesh and blood, the brick and mortar in-person version of these private parental investments in kids. So I sort of think of this paper as sort of the virtual version of that. But I think this kind of story has been going on for a long time. It's just not been in most of our data sets.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now, and people watching online, please don't be shy for questions here in the Q&A box. A question that's coming here is, so were Google searches for online tutoring any part of the initial conversations here?
Andrew, do you remember whether the phrase online tutoring was, we certainly used a lot of variants of online school, online learning, math worksheets. I don't know if we tackled the tutoring phrase.
I actually don't think that tutoring made it on that initial list, because when we were doing this initial search, keep in mind, we were doing all of this work happened in April, and it's really before a lot of the conversation around tutoring was happening. I understand now that it's a large part of the conversation. And recently, Josh and I and Christine have exchanged dozens of emails about what are some new terms that we want. Because like Josh was sort of mentioning in his last slide, it is fair, unlike other data sets where you get one pool of an administrative data set and it's harder to update that, this is much easier to update in real time. And so tutoring is sort of, in my opinion, at the top of the list for the next set of terms that we want to add and explore when we think about the next version of this paper. And there are a number of other terms like that, but tutoring, I think, is at the top of the list. It did not make the list that we generated in April when we first started this, but I think it's a very important term as we continue moving forward on this research. So I take that point. I think it's possible that it was on the list and not very popular at the time that we searched for it, but I don't think it was on the list.
So another question that just came through in the box that just goes on with this a little bit is, can you just give an idea for how you came up with the initial list of terms to do the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a brainstorming exercise between me, Andrew, Christine, a couple of undergraduate research assistants at Brandeis University who had taken my economics of education class, and we basically tried to make as long a list as we could, both sort of using our own knowledge, but also actually exploiting the fact that on Google Trends site, when you put in one search term, it will say something like, here are other search terms commonly sought after by people looking for this one. And so we sort of, I guess, survey X, people call this like a snowball sampling. We sort of just kept, we kept looking for more terms this way. And eventually we had a very long list, some of which we eliminated because it felt like a given term might be more applicable to college age or adult students, some of which were more ambiguous. We wanted to limit the terms to things that felt almost certainly like K-12 specific terms, and we think we came up with a list. My suspicion is that our results would not be terribly sensitive to the exclusion or inclusion of any additional terms people throw out here. But we really would like to hear some of those other terms, because as Andrew said, we do think we're going to do some kind of forward-looking version of this paper, given that the world is continuing to struggle with this issue.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in addition to just brainstorming, asking around to other colleagues who are doing this type of work, Christine and I read just about every article we could find about ed tech and things like that. What are resources that schools are leaning on? And we typed in these words, like Josh was saying, you can sort of test out these words, the popularity of them in real time in Google Trends. And so if there was a word that just nobody was using at all over this period, if the popularity was literally below 1%, Google would not return actually a measure of its intensity. So we did not include those words in the list, even though we did sort of consider them. They didn't make it up to that list of 45. We didn't pull data on them because the data did not exist, because they were so rarely searched for that Google was not publicly willing to provide the data to us.
Right. And just so and you talk about in the paper, I can't remember if you defined it directly when we were talking, but if I'm right, the dependent variable here is how, like, the percentage of searches that were that term, right? So it's all kind of relative to other searches going on at the same time. It's not just number of searches for something. So when that number goes up, it's saying that the proportion of searches within an area that are about this thing has gone up, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we don't have the actual search volume, the number of searches going on.
Another question that's come through in the box here. So can you talk a little bit more about the DMAs themselves? And so they ask, for example, how much variation of income, internet connectivity, et cetera, is there within these DMAs?
So I'll just say, as Andrew said, the DMAs are generally groups of counties. I don't remember on average if it was 3, 4, 5 counties, but they're fairly large geographic areas, smaller than states, but larger than individual counties. And so there's a lot of variation within them. I mean, if you think about the DMA that includes Boston, it almost certainly includes Brookline, Newton, and Lexington as well. And so, in some sense, I think the greatest limitation of this paper is that we don't have individual household level search behavior, that the only way we can get at heterogeneity by income is by saying, well, the Boston area is somewhat wealthier than Western Massachusetts, which is, poorer or wealthier than this part of other. And so that is a limitation of this work. I've done a little bit of poking around through my connections at Google to find out if anyone would ever be willing to turn over individual level search data, but shockingly, that might not happen.
And I'll just add to that by saying that it's roughly, it depends on the DMA, but it's on average maybe about 10 or 12 counties that are aggregated together to be in a DMA. And there, like I said before, there are 210 across the country, and that's it spans the entire United States. And so over the entire United States, you can think that we've sort of divided the data up into 210 regions. So that's sort of the level of specificity that we're working with.
It is actually possible that because of this, our estimates about the heterogeneity, the extent to which low and high income places diverge, my intuition is that we are probably understating the extent to which high and low income individual households differ in this behavior. Because each of our DMAs is sort of mushing together a bunch of people from fairly different parts of the income distribution. My guess is if we had household level data, we would see even stronger disparities by income, but I could be wrong about that.
I mean, just one other piece to put a number or two on it. So on average in our data, 77% of households have broadband internet connectivity. That's across all DMAs. But the standard deviation of that number is about 5.5. So it's, if you were to sort of add 5 and subtract 5 from that 77, you would get down to what, 72 and 83. So between 72 and 83, or roughly about 2/3 of our data have internet connectivity ranging from 72% to 83%. So if you wanted to try to place some rough back in the envelope numbers around it.
So another question that's come through here that I think is interesting is, so can you, and this gets us to the, just kind of thinking through our findings here, your findings here, but what are some implications you can think of for the finding that school-centered resources are seeing a higher increase since March than are the parent-centered resources? Or do you see the data that way?
I mean, I think, Andrew, I don't know what you think about the sort of magnitudes. I think the fact that in general, there's just much more searching for these school-centered resources is a sign that lots of schools are using Google Classroom, are using, you know, EdDojo, Seesaw, all these things. And just the number of schools, the number of students sort of touched by schools who are using those products dwarfs the number of individual parents who are looking for generic math worksheets. And so I'm not totally sure what one makes of that. Part of that may be that the set of households who are looking for things like math worksheets in a generic sense is, you know, perhaps just a small sliver of the population who are particularly worried about math preparation. But I'm not sure without sort of individual household data that we could say much more about that.
I sort of agree with all of that. And I think the biggest takeaway is that people are searching for these school-centered resources at like 20 times the rate that they're searching for the parent-centered resources. I think that's the biggest takeaway. And then both have had fairly large increases, and both have had increases along this SES gradient. But I think trying to say that the increase was relatively larger in, you know, school-centered resources versus parent-centered resources sort of is a side note almost to the main finding, which is just that people are really searching for these school-centered resources just overall at much higher rates. And it's harder than, I think, to draw a big conclusion around these sort of smaller differences about the relative increase in one versus the other. That would be my 2 cents on it. But that's something that we should think about a little bit more, I think.
One question that we can't answer, which is a little frustrating to me, is why is there why are there differences in income by the extent to which people are looking for the school-centered resources? And so you can imagine 2 stories. One is in higher income places, the schools are generally better at providing these kind of online platforms to do remote instruction. Or it could be that schools are all equally good at providing these things, but only parents in high income areas actually take advantage of them or make sure their students are using them. We cannot, with our data, distinguish those stories, and it seems fairly important to distinguish them to think about policy responses.
Yeah, I mean, this is related, and I hope this doesn't get us too into the stats and the wonkiness of it, but and I think, Andrew, your response about it, you know, kind of previous levels of search might hit this a little bit, but I just wonder what you make from it looks like, I mean, so I'm looking at the figure, right, where it's comparing the different by SES. And after March, I mean, you see the clear jump, but the standard errors around each of those jumps get much, like hugely bigger on the school level resources, and not as much on the parent-centered resources. I don't know if that tells us anything about the pattern in the data here, or if I'm just noticing something not very important.
That's a good question. We'll think more about it.
Okay. So another question we have here. So was there an increased search for virtual schools like CASS Mentor, Brown Bag, Learn About Supporting Students on Pre-Health? So was virtual schools part of what we would look for, searching here?
Virtual schools was one of those 45 keywords that we searched for. So it's included in the list of it was included as one of the keywords that we were putting into the parent-centered resource group. Someone who's looking for I think virtual schools and virtual schooling were things that we thought parents might be looking for. Not necessarily something that the school had already connected with the students on to sort of, provide assignments or help grading, but it would be something that a parent might be seeking out. And so it was part of that category.
I think, by the way, that's a great example of a search term where I don't even think that term was in the top 10 of the parent-centered terms, which means that people were not looking for that term in large numbers. I think it would be very interesting to do the follow-up work this fall and ask, now that parents are realizing that this is not just a 3-month disruption, but this might be a 15-month disruption. Presumably there are a lot of parents out there saying, I'm not just looking for math worksheets, I'm looking for a new school entirely. And so I think it will be, for example, we've already done a very initial stab at this. You can see searches for homeschooling dramatically surge. Only in this last month, they didn't in the spring, because the decision point for parents recently has been, which school do I send my kids to? Not, my kid is already in school, what do I do about this breakdown?
Yeah, I mean, I expect you'll see something similar for private schooling, right?
Exactly.
In a lot of these areas, and that does kind of lead us into, and you guys have both talked about, but it's important enough that maybe it's worth poking out a little bit more. Just different ways that you see the ability to use these data and also this design to look at. I mean, this particular issue, obviously, I think like it makes a lot of sense, as you guys were saying, to kind of look at this over time and kind of keep collecting these data. I'm wondering, do we see other things about schooling, about kids, about society that's related to human development and everything else? Like what are different avenues that you might flag for other researchers kind of interested in this?
I think that's a great question. I think I've already had at least one email exchange with another WELIC colleague who studies things like student mental health and bullying, and sort of looking at this data to think about, as people search for terms related to bullying. If anything, if I recall, she did this searching, and you see it's dropping off because presumably because now kids are not in rooms with each other where this kind of antisocial behavior can occur. And so, I'm not sure I have any other sort of broad concrete ideas right now, but it's clear that this kind of data can illuminate forms of student and household and parent behavior that are otherwise pretty hard to get at, certainly in real time, but even in general with sort of typical administrative data sets that a lot of us now use. I don't know if Andrew has had thoughts sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say two things. One, the first thing, I'm not sure that you were actually directly asking this, but I'll say it anyway. And then my second point will actually, I think, answer your question. But first, I mean, I think everything that we've been talking about in terms of what are these additional whenever we present this paper, people ask us, oh, did you look at this keyword or that keyword or this keyword? And so I think eventually it would be really nice. It's easy enough to do where we could create some type of list where we list every single keyword that we've ever searched for and include like the relative popularity of that keyword compared to a couple of different benchmarks like Google Classroom or Khan Academy or Kahoot or online learning, pick some benchmarks, and we can show how those terms have evolved over time. In particular, things like, Marcus, I think you were mentioning, private schools, for example. People probably weren't trying to pull their kids out of the public school sector and enroll in private schools in March. Nobody thought that this was going to last for 6 months or a year or 2 years at that point. Or some people did, but I don't think it was, I don't think as many people believed that as they do now. And so I think you wouldn't have seen a huge spike in things like, how do I enroll my kid in a pod, or how do I set up a pod, or how do I find a full-time tutor to come to my house? Things like that were not popular terms in March and April, but they are now. So setting up some type of like dynamic and exhaustive set of terms and looking at how the popularity of those terms has changed over time is something I'm really interested in doing. So I don't know that you were directly asking about that. I think you were asking more about what are some other avenues of research that this type of design could inform, but I think there's a lot still left to do with this type of with sticking within online resources and online education specifically. In terms of other research, I know that I've also been in conversations with people around searches for mental health, especially because mental health is something that's come up a lot, and as it kind of relates to bullying, but yeah, I think COVID has a lot to do with that, and people are turning online to search, especially for things that they might not feel comfortable eliciting true feelings or true behavior in certain forms. Google is a place that you can often turn to sort of search for those things that you might not be comfortable sharing with your boss or colleague or others. And so I think mental health is another area that's ripe for this type of study.
Okay. Andrew, I'm glad that even as in your first month as an assistant professor here, that you've learned the important media, the answer the question you want to answer, not necessarily the one that you've asked. It's an important thing to learn early on. So you're
I did both, I guess.
So another interesting question has come through in the box. So say it'd be interesting to compare your list of terms with for-profit companies' use of SEO to rise to the top and sell more lessons to parents, teachers during this time. So they give the example, so perhaps Google Classroom's at the top of your list because they have access to the data, including the volume of what people are searching for. So maybe if there was some activity here to kind of push particular groups onto the top of like the advertising bar, I think is what we're getting at here.
So I'm sympathetic to the nature of that question, although the one thing that makes me a little bit skeptical when it comes to sort of terms like Google Classroom is that those products are things that individual households cannot use without the school already having a contract with that entity. And so if a parent is searching for Google Classroom, I think 99% of the time it's because they've been told by their school, this is the product that we use, this is the platform we use to interact with students virtually. So I don't think that one at least is a great example of sort of trying to sell individual parents on a product. There may be other examples less like that, but I think one of the reasons we like this this list of school-centered resources is that for most of them, we could be fairly sure that the only reason a parent would be looking for that search term is because the school had said, this is the platform we will be using.
And also, just to be clear, I agree with that interpretation, but just to be clear on what it is that we're actually measuring, it's not the first thing that comes up when you type in, online resources, and it's not that Google Classroom is the first thing that comes up. It's that someone is actually typing Google Classroom in. They're seeking that specific phrase out. And now it could certainly be that SEO somehow changes how people are seeking out those phrases, and Google Classroom might have the best advertising, and for a number of, I can think of a whole host of reasons, but what we're capturing is what people are actually typing in and they're seeking out, not the number one thing that comes up, which Google clearly has, their algorithm has a ton of control over. If you type in online learning resources, maybe Google Classroom is the number one thing that pops up every single time, but that's actually not what we're capturing in this measure.
Interesting. So we're reaching the end of our time here. this is excellent work. I think it speaks to like a lot of different aspects that have been, you know, if important, but maybe, you know, below the surface in thinking about education policy for a long time. I mean, issues around like the digital divide, and it also kind of speaks to issues around, you know, I think, Josh, you talked about this in your part, like talking about, you know, the resources that parents bring at home, right? Like this is, my guess is that this is, your finding is just emblematic of something that's always been there. It's just the resource that anyone was looking for has been different before, you know, before it came, you know, COVID, you know, came into our lives. You know, I'm wondering, so I guess I'll leave you. Do you have any kind of, are there any parting issues that you want to make sure that we raise here, or kind of areas for this work, or you know, how you think that this is going to impact, you know, going forward in schools?
Yeah, I think broadly, you know, the reason we wanted to use the phrase sort of household adaptation in the title of the paper is because the pandemic is such a large shock to the nature of schooling for almost every child, you know, on the planet, but certainly in our country, that there are going to be all sorts of household reactions that are going to be extremely important to understand when trying to explain years from now why learning gaps changed, why college enrollment rates changed, why various educational outcomes changed. And some of those adaptations are short-run adaptations, you know, scrambling to find math worksheets in the spring of 2020. And some of them are going to be long-run adaptations, like parents abandoning school systems that don't reopen in person in favor of other forms of education. And so I think I love this paper. As Andrew said, it was, you know, it's amazing how that we were really doing it in real time. It's a very unusual thing for us to do. But I think that this kind of approach may still be fruitful, you know, even a year or two from now, and beginning to think about what are the longer run implications of the way decision-making is changing for parents and students.
And the last thing I'll just say really briefly, because I know we're just about out of time, is that as Josh mentioned, I was really pleased to work on a paper essentially in real time and get the results out so fast that as schools and districts are considering how to implement schooling this current year, our research is out. We're on webinars like this talking about it. And I think it's important to, I don't think any of the findings surprise anyone, but I think it's important to sort of quantify the extent to which these differences in access and demand for online learning resources differed in the period directly following COVID. And that can inform, even right now, how school leaders are thinking about providing extra resources to certain types of students, or you know, trying to potentially offer different types of solutions as they move forward throughout this year. So I'm just happy that we were able to do it so quickly and get it out in a timely manner, and hopefully contribute to the conversation over the next school year.
Yeah, this is great. Well, and I agree with all that. So I think I'll bring us to a close here. Thank you, Andrew and Josh, for this great work. We're really excited to, I mean, one, for this paper, but also to have you guys here with us at BU WheeLock and what we've been building in educational policy. Thanks everyone who's been attending. I'll ask you, please, if you're with us, stick around for a couple minutes. There should be a quick, very brief 5-question survey that comes about that would really help us with some information about the webinar series. And please, if you're new to the series, flag this for the future. We're holding these weekly on different topics at the same time. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining to watch, and thank you, Andrew and Josh, for this great work and for sharing with us today.
Thank you
for having us.
Bye.